It's a great honor and pleasure for the International Peace Research Association to have this special plenary panel at our 28th biennial conference, co-hosted and spotlighted with the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders. You know, despite my gray hair and apparent age, I'm actually from the next generation, the second generation of peace researchers, not one of the founding era of IPRA. And so when I first was elected Secretary General of the organization, one of the things I understood was a priority was to spend a little bit of time and check in with one of that founder generation, one of the great leading icons of the field, Dr. Betty Reardon. It didn't hurt that Betty and I are both New Yorkers, so it was a pretty easy phone call. And of course, we had connections over the decades. And when I had that time with Betty, it was not just inspiring, as it always is, to talk to Betty Reardon, but it was also very particularly inspiring along a political path, because Betty said essentially three things. She said, I don't know why you would be doing this work at this moment. I don't have any time to lose. I can't, spend time doing things that are not going to be effective. So you shouldn't either. So unless you're dealing with working around issues of climate change as part of a peace and justice agenda, unless you're working with young people and new generations, and unless you're working with women and women leadership, and not just pretending that women was somehow going to be magically part of the agenda, even if it's male-led and male-centered, then what exactly are you doing as an association and as a movement? And by the way, along the lines of those three things, there is this group that I helped to birth, that I helped to found, that other great peace educators have also played a role in, like Cora Weiss. And that group is the Global Network of Women's Peacebuilders. You should check them out. So I did just that. And since that time, here in New York at least, IPRA and the GNWP have really played a co-partnering role with some of our UN work. And so it's a natural alliance, not just in New York, not just at the United Nations, but for peace builders everywhere to understand those priorities and to understand the natural and wonderful nature of this alliance, which you'll hear about not in direct form, but you'll hear about in political context by the voices that we're going to hear from today. And I really should now just stop, but there's one additional thing I need to say in this words of welcome. As the only male-gendered person on this panel today, it's a double honor to be doing this welcome and this introduction. And I think it underscores and speaks to the fact that we're not talking about women's issues here. We're talking about fundamental issues of peace and justice. We don't get to these issues of peace and justice unless we both challenge the concepts of manhood and what it means to be a man or be a real man, and unless we form allyship and we form solidarity with women's leadership. And, when I say we, I'm talking about all people, but I'm also thinking about the special role that male-gendered people have, that men have, to understand that solidarity means stepping back. Solidarity means, at very least, power sharing. And solidarity means an allyship that's accountable and rigorous. I'm going to make one quote from an old friend, John Stoltenberg, a radical pro-feminist male who's written a lot about refusing to be a real man, refusing to be a man, and the peace and justice context. He wrote, "Men's adherence to manhood requires animus and opposition in order to exist and to be experienced as authentic. Well, if we're going to look at 21st century issues of peace and justice, we have to create a new definition of manhood that's about partnership, alliances, allyship, and genuine peace building, recognizing women's leadership. The global network of women's peace builders are amongst the most inspiring leaders that we could work with and follow. And it's a great honor to be with you all, be with them all today, and to welcome them in this extraordinary forum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt, for these very powerful words, particularly on what it means to be a genuine ally and the role and responsibility that men have towards male gender equality or gender equality. So I'll just very quickly introduce myself. My name is Dina Lakhal, and I'm a program officer at the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders and the geographical focal point for the MENA region. So thank you all once again for joining us today to our intergenerational dialogue on sustainable strategies for inclusive peacebuilding. We have an amazing panel. So before we jump into the discussion, I want to take a few minutes to very briefly introduce the speakers. So joining us today is Dr. Betty Reardon, who is a world leader and pioneer on peace education and human rights. Among her many accomplishments, Dr. Reardon is the founder of the Peace Education Program at Teachers College at Columbia University, and her pioneering work has laid the foundation for cross-disciplinary integration of peace education and international human rights from a gender-conscious perspective. I'm also very proud to share that Dr. Reardon is a member of GNWP's International Advisory Council. And then we have Mavic Cabrera-Baeza, who is the founder and chief executive officer at the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders and an internationally recognized WPS expert who has been leading and pioneering work on many areas of women, peace, and security, including on national action plans, localization of a UN Security Council Resolution 1325, monitoring and reporting, among other areas. She has also authored a number of research papers and toolkits on WPS and related issues. And among her many accomplishments, Mavic was one of the 2 civil society initiators of the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, and currently serves as a board member to the Generation Equality Compact on women, peace and security, and humanitarian action. We also have Weven Muganda, who is a young human rights activist from Mombasa, Kenya, and I'm very proud to say GNWP's newest Cora Weiss Peacebuilding Fellow. She is the recipient of the She Can Award for her outstanding work advancing human rights and increasing access to justice for women affected by violence. Weven also co-initiated Mutual Aid Kenya, which was a COVID-19 response initiative working with communities and informal settlements of Mombasa and Nairobi. She is part of UNDP's Global Youth Program and serves on the advisory board for Mombasa Women Social Justice Center. And last but not least, Malika Iyer is a program officer at the Global Network of Women Peacebuilders. She is the geographical focal point for Asia and coordinates GNWP's Young Women Leaders for Peace program in Indonesia, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Ukraine, and the Philippines, which promotes young women's meaningful participation in political decision-making, peace processes, preventing violent extremism, and gender-sensitive humanitarian action. As a specialist on youth peace and security and women peace and security, she's very active at the global level, at the global advocacy level for inclusive peace building for women and youth. And now I will jump right into the panel. So as your moderator, I will try to have this in a talk show style format. So I will ask each of you a first round of questions to which you will have about 6 minutes to answer. And then I will follow up and ask a second round of question, which you will have about 3 or so minutes to answer. And in the spirit of having an intergenerational dialogue, I will start with you, Weven. So my question to you is, young women in Kenya have been at the forefront of peace building. You yourself are a youth activist working with local communities. So what do you think is the role of youth, especially young women, in preventing conflict and building peace and advancing the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security and Youth Peace and Security agendas? And can you share some specific examples of innovative strategies led by young women, and what kind of support they need to overcome the challenges that they face?
Thank you so much, Dina. It's really an honor to be here today. Just to jump onto the topic of discussion is that as young women and as young peace builders, we have a key role to play in ensuring that we build peaceful and inclusive societies. First is community education. For many young people, we come from generations where levels of literacy were a bit lower. And we are seeing an increasing level of awareness amongst our generations and the generations to come. And so the role to educate not just our peers, but those in our communities that didn't have the opportunity to know and learn about things such as human rights, peace education, the UN resolutions such as WPS and YPS. This is upon us. And because we believe that, you know, when you share information, like having the information is power, but really sharing this information is the greatest power, because then you're not only giving these people opportunity to speak up for themselves, but you're also relieving the burden on yourself as young activists to be able to take on the challenges that the community faces. Another thing is engaging in local peace processes. So in Kenya, we have like peace committees at the village level, and these are supposed to be like committees that solve the different insecurity challenges that face the community at the village level, and they rise all the way to the national level. As young people, these are the first avenues of participation, especially in peace processes. And before, these avenues were only available to the older generation, but for the past 6 years, especially when violent extremism became very rampant at the coast of Kenya, we've seen more young people going to peace committees, taking up leadership opportunities in these peace committees, and helping to mediate and also just conduct dialogue forums in the community. And then another thing that I personally am passionate about is mobilizing young people to take action. So many a times I think young people may underestimate the level of power that they have to create change. But when we come together, we really have the numbers, and power speaks to power. So while we may not have the financial resources to really push for bigger change, the power that we have is our numbers. And so when we come together, there is so much that can be done. And I can attest to this through an initiative that I co-founded called Mutual Aid Kenya. And it wasn't really an initiative per se, but when COVID hit, we were talking amongst a group of friends, and we were talking about how vulnerable populations will not be able to go out, seeing the conditions that were set up by WHO, such as social distancing, staying at home. These things are not practical in our community setup, where people live in slums and people really have to go to work every other day, or else it's either they will die of COVID or they will starve from hunger. So we mobilized young people, about 100 volunteers in 2 towns. We were able to crowdfund online. We were able to bring people together to run errands for the older people so that they can stay home. And we mobilized for their food, medical supplies, and this was really non-programmatic because we didn't have any sort of funding. What we really wanted to do is just support our communities, our friends, people we knew, and in time we realized that we were reaching out to over 2,000 families in a span of 3-4 months. And that just shows that the power of people coming together. And right now, as we are moving towards the digital era more, we see how social media is playing a key role. And this is something that young people can take advantage of. Using arts, using sports. I come from a town where football and swimming and cycling is really, really popular. And so every time you have a sports event, it doesn't matter what they're coming to do, young people will always show up. And these are the opportunities that we've been using to educate young people, to bring them together and organize them into groups that they can then foster change and many other activities. And so it goes without saying that young people are already taking action, and more young people want to take action, but some do not know how to. And so young peace builders are taking the initiative of educating others on how they can participate. And I see an opportunity where the older generation can really support young people in terms of guiding us, in terms of building our capacity to engage. Just an example is that through Mutual Aid Kenya, we were participating in formulation of the Senate bill. We were participating. Yeah, so can I continue?
Yes, your video is a little bit blurry, but that's okay. We can still see you and hear you clearly.
Okay, so we were participating in the formation of the Pandemic Response Management Bill by the Senate. And we really, to be honest, we really didn't have the capacity to engage with senators. And this actually led to us being kicked out at certain meetings. We didn't know how to go through the processes. What we knew was just speaking up for what we wanted the Senate to include in the bill. And so these are some of the gaps and challenges that young peace builders face that I think those who have experience can come in to, work with us and show us the way in how we can go about some of these processes. Of course, lobbying and advocating for the protection of young activists is important so that we can continue to do this work without fear of our lives or fear of being victimized or being discriminated, especially from the communities that we live in. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Weven. You're absolutely right. I think there is a great force and power in numbers among youth, but not just in number, but also in innovation. I think youth have really strategic and out-of-the-box ideas for community mobilization and community action, both online and offline, as you mentioned. And there is that power in numbers and creating and sustaining a culture of peace. Turning over to Mavic. Mavic, localization is one of GNWP's flagship programs, which under your leadership has expanded to almost 20 countries and has been internationally recognized as a key strategy for effective implementation of women, peace, and security, including in at least 8 Secretary General reports to the Security Council. What are some of the lessons learned from implementing women, peace, and security through localization, and how does localization promote inclusive and sustainable peace building?
First, thank you so much to the International Peace Research Association for this collaboration. We value it, and the researchers and the research community is an important partner for the global network of women peace builders, because the outcomes of various research efforts are used very, very strategically by us and other civil society as advocacy instrument, as evidence-based instrument that we present to policymakers to draw their attention and generate accountability. Onto your question, Dina, the first lesson is actually the motivation for me and for GNWP to embark on an extensive localization program. It's a methodology and at the same time a strategy in effective implementation of policies. So what we have observed working on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and in the recent years, the Youth, Peace and Security agenda, is that policy making is only taking place at the global level and at the national level, policy making and decision making. And then they move on and for lack of a better way of describing it, the policymakers, move on to ram down the policies on the throats of local populations. So here is a policy, here is a document, we've deliberated on this, we've adopted it, it has a stamp of approval by, you know, by the cabinet or by Congress, now you need to implement it. So that has been the culture in policy making and policy implementation, that local population do not have the capacity, do not have the agency, and therefore they are just recipients of policies that they must follow, they must obey. And that is why we see a lot of laws and policies that are only on paper, that are stuck on or piled up in the shelves of government bureaucracies, gathering dust, and no one cares. So we thought of what would be the implementation strategy that would really make a difference, that would really transform the words into realistic and necessary action on the ground. So that is why we started looking at the governance structures. And we learned that in many governments, there are actually decentralized systems or autonomous governance structures, which can serve as a foundation of the localization program. So what it brought out is that local leadership, ownership, and participation is a necessary ingredient in policy making and policy implementation, especially the leadership, ownership, and participation by local women and young people. Again, without which the Women, Peace, and Security resolutions, the national action plans on women, peace, and security, and now some national action plans on youth, peace, and security as well, or roadmaps as they call them in some countries, will again be like other laws and policies, gathering dust on the shelves of government bureaucracies. I think it's important to highlight some examples of the difference or the transformation that were brought about by the localization program, if I have your permission to do that. Concrete examples in local districts in Uganda, where the localization program has been adopted, we have documented that there is 6 times more reporting on sexual and gender-based violence after the localization strategy was adopted. As some of you might know, Uganda is one of the 86 countries that have national action plans. But before adapting localization, it was also sitting in the bureaucracies in Kampala. So after we've worked with local authorities and local civil societies, such as the Coalition for Action 1325 in Uganda, we were able to encourage the local district authorities to ensure that there are women's desks in police stations. And that encouraged women to go to the police stations and report the sexual and gender-based violence crimes committed against them. And that's the start of ending impunity. As we know, the general statistics is that only 20% of sexual and gender-based violence crimes are reported. But in those districts, that has increased, and that is leading to investigation, prosecution, and penalizing perpetrators. So another example is in the Philippines, where I come from. In one indigenous community, they have their own peace building council, which is also serving as a local court. And it's called Bodong, BODONG. And it has 24 council members who also serve as local judges. Keep in mind that the council is also serving as a court. And this is very important in that indigenous community, because all the cases are brought to the Bodong Council, anywhere from land disputes, arguments or cases about irrigation, which is very important in a farming community, couples separating, theft and robbery in the community. And for over a century, the Bodong Council consists of 24 male judges. And after localization, it was about 2 or 2.5 years of consistent workshop series and capacity building on what Resolution 1325 is, what the National Action Plan is, why is it important, why women's leadership and participation in decision making is important. They invited 5 women to be members of the Bodong over a century. For the first time, they invited 5 women. And when we visited about a couple of years after these women joined the Bodong Council, we spoke with the members of the council, and it was the men who first, spoke up. And they said it made a huge difference in how the Bodong Council is operating. First and foremost, more people, especially women, are coming to the Bodong to report the crimes committed against them and crimes in the community. We are more efficient. We are able to review cases in a more timely fashion, and we are able to come to effective decisions that we, that we present to the concerned individuals and the community in general. And they said, our only regret is that we did not invite the women to join the council. So those are just 2 of the many examples of localization. And what we are also doing is, when we organize the localization program, we bring in national level policymakers and decision makers, because the idea is for the localization program to be a bottom-up strategy. And therefore, these success stories in local communities in Uganda, in the Philippines, in Sierra Leone, in Colombia, must influence national level policy making. And then from the national to the regional and global. That's how it becomes a bottom-up strategy for the local success story in policy making and policy implementation to influence the higher levels of policy and decision making. I'll stop here and look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Mavic, for these powerful words. I couldn't agree more. Localization is about shifting the power back to the people, because it brings people together to collectively analyze the relevance of national and global policies on women, peace, and security, but implement them in a way that reflects local realities and priorities. And this leads to tangible results. As you mentioned, in Uganda, there's 6 times more reporting on GBV as a result of localization. But the process itself, in addition to the tangible results that it produces, the process itself is deeply inclusive, and it's a participatory exercise that brings people together and promotes inclusive and sustainable peace building. So moving on to Malika, So as a program officer at JNWP, you have been involved in the organization's advocacy to strengthen the synergies of different agendas linked to peace and security. There's the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, Youth, Peace and Security Agenda, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, various frameworks on humanitarian action as well. So from your perspective, why is the nexus or the linkages between all of these agendas so important, and what should it look like in practice? You know, what strategies do you use to operationalize them or strengthen their accountability or implementation?
Thanks for the question, Dina, and thank you to the organizers for having this timely discussion. To put it very simply, women and youth do not live their lives in agendas. They experience varied impacts of armed conflict, including displacement, climate insecurity, recruitment and radicalization by extremist groups, poverty, and so on. And their experiences are often exacerbated by their gender identity, age, sexual orientation, disabilities, citizenship, religion, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. These impacts of armed conflict can rarely be adequately addressed by one framework or agenda. So naturally, we cannot work in silos on different issues related to women, peace, and security. Intersectionality is integral to effective peace building. It requires an understanding of the unique and interwoven sets of challenges that impact a vulnerable person as essential to provide them with the right kind of aid or programming. So I'll outline 3 areas of intersectionality, but of course there are many. First, the Women, Peace and Security and Youth, Peace and Security agendas are inextricably linked. The double marginalization young women and girls experience as women and youth, and the resulting disproportionate impact of violence and armed conflict are overlapping concerns in the agendas. Both agendas aim to address the violence of exclusion of women, young men, and gender nonconforming persons in political decision-making and peace processes. Without their participation, peace processes do not respond to their specific needs. And finally, both agendas aim to prevent conflict and prioritize disarmament through sustainable and inclusive processes. This is often forgotten by member states or overlooked. As we can see, only 30% of national action plans on women, peace, and security even mention disarmament. Global military expenditure has reached $1.8 trillion, while youth organizations are leading critical advocacy for sustainable peace and gender equality continue to operate on annual budgets of less than $10,000. This figure proves that governments would rather address outbreaks of violence through militarized approaches instead of addressing the root causes of conflict. And that is really the most critical aspect of both agendas, which push for sustainable peace and gender equality. So given these overlaps, it's important for us to advocate for synergies, not silos, in the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security and Youth, Peace and Security agendas. The Sustaining Peace agenda also embraces intersectionality, arguing that peace cannot merely be defined as the absence of war. To women's civil society around the world, human rights, human security, good governance, sustainable development, responsible natural resource management, access to education, healthcare, economic security, and a harmonious community relying on nonviolent conflict resolution are some of the pillars of peace. Therefore, peace building must encompass more than just securitized or militarized efforts to resolve conflict. The agenda underlines that a multi-sectoral, locally driven, and locally owned action is needed to ensure effective peace building and conflict prevention. Critically, and perhaps most importantly, peace building must address the drivers of conflict through sustainable, inclusive, and intersectional programs and initiatives. Without responding to the root causes of conflict, it's impossible to eradicate insecurity and violence. And I have a statistic to back that up. 90% of conflicts that started in the 21st century are in countries that have already experienced a civil war. And after 2003, any civil war that started was the resumption of a previous war. So that's consistent with recent evidence of the reoccurrence of violence due to a failure to effectively address the drivers of conflict through sustainable, inclusive, and intersectional peace building, peace processes, and post-conflict resolution. The Women, Peace and Security and Sustaining Peace agendas must be jointly implemented, prioritizing local women's leadership and meaningful participation in effectively preventing and resolving conflict. Now, conflict causes and fuels the majority of humanitarian emergencies in combination with other drivers such as natural disasters, climate change, economic stress, or as we're currently experiencing, a global health crisis. Most humanitarian emergencies become protracted crises requiring responses to promote long-term peace, stability, sustainable development, and gender equality. Promoting synergies between the Women, Peace and Security resolutions and humanitarian frameworks is essential for the development and implementation of sustainable, inclusive, and gender-sensitive humanitarian aid, which addresses the root causes of crises and builds community resilience. I'm sure it isn't shocking that crisis-affected women, young women, and girls are at a heightened risk of gender-based violence, forced marriage, trafficking, maternal mortality, amongst many, many other serious threats. And although women make up 67 million of the 136 million people in need of humanitarian assistance in the world, humanitarian emergency programs are rarely gender sensitive, nor do they prioritize response to the needs of women and girls. The Women, Peace and Security agenda is a critical tool that brings both a gender and a conflict lens to humanitarian action. Recently, there's been growing attention to the triple nexus between peace building, sustainable development, and humanitarian action in frameworks such as the Grand Bargain. Effectively bridging the gaps between humanitarian action, gender equality, and peace building requires investing in the capacities of local actors, particularly women's rights organizations and national systems, to implement effective and empowering humanitarian emergency response rooted in a human security framework. During the 20th anniversary of Security Council Resolution 1325 on Women, Peace and Security, the 5th anniversary of Security Council Resolution 2250 on Youth, Peace and Security, and the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which all happened this past year in 2020, women's rights activists and youth peace builders came together to demand intersectionality and synergies in the implementation of frameworks related to peace, security, and gender equality. The stakes are high, we have no time to lose, and so we all need to prioritize inclusive, sustainable, and intersectional peace building. Thank you.
Thank you, Malika. I think my general takeaway from your remarks is that we don't live our lives in silos, and as a result, we shouldn't look at policies in silos either, and that we can strengthen implementation of all of these policy frameworks that you've mentioned by addressing them as mutually reinforcing and synergistic. And prevention of conflict is at the heart of all of the agendas that you've mentioned, and women and youth peace builders know a thing or two about prevention and are well placed to lead decision-making on these issues. So we've now heard from 3 speakers on various strategies for inclusive peace building, the role and the innovation of youth, localization, and the promotion of synergies on peace and security frameworks. And so my next question is to Dr. Reardon. Dr. Reardon, you are a leading expert and scholar on human rights, gender equality, peace, and militarism. So my question to you is, how can we strengthen gender perspectives in security discourse, and how can demilitarization be used as a strategy to advance the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda?
Thank you, Dina. And I want to thank all of you who have offered these wonderful ideas about the significance of gender to peace issues. But I'd also like to make a little amendment on Dina's introduction. I am not an expert I am an intentional learner, and that's an ongoing, continuous process. And I think that that process has been very evident in every presentation we've heard so far. Essentially, I also want to identify myself not so much as a university person, but as a teacher and an educator and a networker. And you pointed to my work at Teachers College, Columbia, but even more important is another endeavor I undertook with Cora Weiss, the Global Campaign for Peace Education, which is attempting to help people throughout the world do the kind of learning that is evident in your presentations. So with that as a background, I'd like to comment on the questions. There are two interrelated questions that Dina has presented. And in the first question, you ask about the role of gender in illuminating the security discourse more toward peace, or that's what I took to be the meaning of your question. I think we have to understand that gender is all of the things that Malika mentioned. But primarily, gender is a device through which all people are placed in the patriarchal pyramid of power that is at the core of the world system. So that what is important about a gender perspective is that it focuses on who is vulnerable in that system. Excuse me. It is important to understand that there are significant vulnerabilities built into that system, and that for the most part, it serves the system to have those vulnerabilities remain somewhat invisible to those other than the vulnerable themselves. So when we use a gender perspective, we are looking toward consequences that reveal vulnerability, reveal how vulnerability is built into the institutions and the system. So that the security discourse has to constantly be aware of the kind of institutional consequences and restraints that Mavic mentioned when she spoke about policy made on the top of the pyramid being imposed at the bottom. So we need always to ask the question of how does any policy impact the security of the vulnerable. And by security, we also mean such things as the COVID crisis that Werfen's group responded to, all of the aspects that Mavic pointed out that were considered in the local councils, and to see that security is indeed a complex, made up of, is a complex of multiple components of what it takes for human well-being. And that's why, one of the reasons why I raised to Matt, as he mentioned, the question of climate and the question of the environment. The overarching security issue right now is the Earth crisis. And all of these crises are interrelated It's not just intersectionality, but interfunctionality. They work together as they are conditioned to function by this hierarchical system that is held in place by militarized violence. So the questions we must always ask are, what are the effects on the vulnerable and the security, and what makes for their security? What makes for their security is a healthy environment, having their needs met, being respected and having their rights fulfilled, and being protected from avoidable harm. In some ways, we can say that COVID was unavoidable, but in many ways, the impact of COVID was avoidable. And Werfen's group responded to that. That is a security action, raising those questions that led to that action should be part of the security discourse. So we need to be aware of the institutions. And when you ask about demilitarization, what I see as demilitarization is the process of transforming institutions that are held in place by force, the threat of force, and by the use from time to time of violence. When we look at any kind of strategy, we can ask ourselves, will this help to change the institutions as well as meet the objectives we are setting forth here? How can we convert these institutions into structures that will lead more to human security? And how can we do it in a way which does not harm any in the institutions or any dependent upon the institutions? So these are all questions that I would call demilitarization questions, or questions related to changing systems from force dependency to common good dependency. If the primary motivation for public policy would become achieving the common good, then it would become quite apparent that some of the programs that GNWP is working on now, such as the reduction of military expenditures, are common sense measures to achieve the common good. But they are not measures that are calling for a quick and radical restructuring of the institutions. Radical, yes, but organic changes that are made looking to the consequences of each change. Not that demilitarization means reducing harm, reducing dependence on force, and that we cannot push forward things that may have harmful consequences that we did not intend. So I would say that demilitarization is the guiding question of how we reduce violence, how we advance the common good, and how we work toward a society in which human security is the primary concern of all public policy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reardon. Wow, there's a lot to digest, but thank you so much for the very powerful words. A gender perspective allows us to shed light on power structures and on who is vulnerable. So strengthening gender and security discourse can only strengthen peace. And so moving on now, in the spirit of having an intergenerational dialogue, the second part of the panel discussion, I will ask Wevin and Malika to answer first, and to answer the question, what can young women, peacebuilders and young women activists like yourselves learn from older women peacebuilders? And then on the flip side, I will ask Dr. Reardon and Mavic, what can you learn from young women, and what kind of advice do you have for young women who are working to advance a culture of peace and working to prevent conflict? So we'll start with Wevin and Malika first.
Thank you so much, Dina. This is really an enlightening conversation. And I'd just like to mention that, I mean, the first thing that we would learn is all this knowledge and wisdom that has been accumulated through years of experience working with communities, working on policies, working on strategies. It's, I mean, just listening to Mavic and Dr. Reardon today, I mean, I personally have been, I've learned so much. But also the other thing that probably we can learn is, investing in knowledge, not just for ourselves, but investing in knowledge for other young people and other young peace builders, so that this knowledge can then translate and can also change the way we design our programs, design our initiatives at the local level. For many young people, and I can speak for myself, we go into movement building and community development out of passion and out of a desire to change a situation in our communities and in our neighborhoods. And it can go so far if we're able to then learn about how, for instance, so now we have experience working at the local level, but how does this then translate all the way to the top? Because we need a bottom-up approach, but we also need a top-bottom approach, and we also need to bring them to shake things on the sides and bring everyone on board. So we can't really take one approach, because there's so much to achieving peace and security that cannot be achieved through one approach. And finally, just something else that we can learn is how can we finance our initiatives? How can we source for resources in terms of skills, in terms of funding, in terms of networks and opportunities? As Dr. Betty said, she's a networker. So how can we network to ensure that the impact of our work just goes beyond our communities? Because when it does that, then it creates a bigger force. We see how movements everywhere, it starts with one person, and in one time it's a global movement, and that can't happen without intentional networking, intentional learning. And I think that's something that I have learned and I'm interested in learning, but I think every other young activist can do that.
Thank you, Evan. Over to you, Malika.
Thanks. I don't have too much to add to what Wevin said, but I would agree with her. Maybe another important lesson, or in my mind, perhaps the most important lesson young women can learn from older women peace builders is about resilience and perseverance. Peace building can be hard work. It can be tempting to give up when things get too challenging, but we as young women are inspired by the strength and determination of women peace builders who came before us, and that helps us push on. The groundwork women's rights activists and feminists like Angela Davis and Laima Gaboe laid for us shapes our advocacy and activism. And from them, we can learn, as Wevan was saying, about movement building, but also organizational strengthening. How do we sustain our movement once we've started something? How do we concretize our work and continue it across generations? And how do we use our work to build broad-based support amongst national stakeholders and perhaps people we don't normally interact with, maybe in the security sector, traditional and religious leaders? How do we really build strong, long-lasting partnerships, which so many women's rights activists have done year after year? And then the last thing that comes to mind, which young people are now doing, but we need to do more, is taking advantage of the global advocacy platforms that are available. We all know the kind of movement building that went into the 1995 Beijing conference, and we just saw the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the Women's International War Tribunal. These are huge examples of women's rights activism, and we're seeing replicated or amplified year after year by women's groups. So just taking these examples and continuing to build on them and use the best practices and successful advocacy strategies as we continue this very, very important work.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Malika. And so now on to Mavic and Dr. Reardon. What can you learn, or what have you learned from young women, and what advice do you have for young women peace builders and young women activists who are looking to promote a culture of peace and prevent conflict? So Mavic, over to you first, and then we'll close with Dr. Reardon.
Thank you. I often hear and also subscribe to the idea of mentorship. I totally embrace it. And you have most of you that I'm working with now, you've started working with me as interns and volunteers. And in doing so, I am and continue to serve as a mentor. And for me, it's, it requires an investment of time and energy and resources as well. And on the one hand, I see it as, the return of investment, if I may put it that way, is important for GNWP. It has helped us to function effectively. Most of the work that we've done, the outputs that we've produced and disseminated, is the work of interns and volunteers. But not every, I've worked with over 100 interns and volunteers now since the founding of GNWP. But not all of them go to GNWP the same way. Not all of them return to GNWP in an equal manner, because people have different priorities. They take different paths in their careers and their academic pursuits. But to me, it's a contribution to the movement, the women's movement, and our women, peace, and security community. But more than that, to me, it's a process of learning. So mentorship is two ways. I share what my experiences are, the learnings that I've had, but I get back so much, maybe even more than I am giving. So I really encourage those who are, have been in this work ahead of some of you, or more senior, if I may, more senior in this work, that we look at mentorship as a learning opportunity, as a two-way learning opportunity. And that's, for me, is the most important lesson that I've gained in working with young people. And I'm also inspired by their boldness, their fearlessness, and their curiosity. you know, the lack of um, not being intimidated by new things, by the capacity to explore. So what do I, you know, what can I advise young people? First and foremost is to recognize your power and capacity and celebrate that, and build on that. Don't underestimate what you can contribute
Can't talk,
or
still
what
going
difference
on.
you can make. Betty?
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm,
And then, yeah, just a couple more points. Work hard and be patient. The challenge that many young people have now, and I guess challenge for everyone, is there's a lot of information. There's so many tools, and it makes access to information and access to knowledge very easy and very quick. But how profound and meaningful, how reliable the information and the knowledge that we get. So it requires patience. It requires hard work. It requires longer time to see or to distinguish, to make a distinction on which is valuable, which is not, which is trash, and which is really meaningful. So that's one challenge that I think young people should continue to confront and navigate, and always go back to the traditional, maybe old-fashioned values that your parents and grandparents are, you know, are imparting on you, which are kindness, compassion, empathy, honesty, value of hard work. They are not really contrary to being bold, being fierce, being curious, and being adventurous. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mavic. I can confidently and proudly say that when I think of a mentor, you are what comes to mind as someone who invests in and, for lack of a better word, someone who trusts young people and young women specifically to rise to the occasion and do the work that needs to be done, even when it's difficult or challenging or even intimidating. And to me, this fosters, you know, a feminist sisterhood that is within the organization, but also extends beyond the organization as well. And so on to Dr. Reardon now. What have you learned or can you learn from young women, and what advice do you have for young women who are following or stepping into your footsteps?
don't trip, don't trip. I want to just reinforce everything that Mavic said. And since this is intergenerational, as the oldest generation represented, I have had generations of learning from those younger than I, starting with when I was a teacher of 7th and 8th and 9th grades, which were the years in which I learned everything that I had to know about teaching that was most relevant when I got to graduate school, teaching graduate school. But I think also Mavic points to the intergenerational kind of learning that is integral to the major movements in the world today. Some of these movements have been ongoing, and there are many white heads still in the demonstrations. But many of them have been initiated by this generation of activists. And I have learned so much about how to see certain issues. I have been so deeply inspired by the merger of integrity and concern that these movements show. I was appalled. I have not heard any news this morning, but I was appalled at what happened January 7th, 6th, whatever, 6th, in the Capitol. I noticed that there were some young people scattered among those who invaded the capital of the United States. But for the most part, they were middle-aged and older, more men than women, although the one who died was a woman. And I contrasted that to what I saw in the streets of New York in a Black Lives Matter demonstration. We all know that at the edges there were some who were desperate and behaved imprudently, but they were not at the forefront. They were not the ones who were pushing over the barriers. It was a movement that was informed, it had integrity, it had what we would call soul, profound spirit. And so many times in these days, I have been held up by the spirit of the young. And in the days when all of us need hope, the hope that we can take from the activism, from the sensible activism that Malika calls you to, from the committed activism that Werfen has demonstrated. This is something which is the precious gift of the younger generation of activists to those who are in the very last stages, that we have hope that whatever you do will be a significant contribution to the dreams that we have had since we were your age. And I thank you all for what I have learned from you and what you will continue to teach others.
Thank you, Dr. Reardon, for these powerful words. I'm also deeply concerned and saddened by the events at the Capitol, but it's conversations like these with women and men, since we do have a man on the panel, like yourselves, that help me maintain hope and maintain optimism for progressive change, despite the global pushback on democracy and on human rights and women's rights that we've been seeing, not just this year, but in previous years as well. We are past time, so I will keep it brief, but as a representative of GNWP, I want to recognize and appreciate the ongoing partnership with IPRA that made this panel discussion possible, and I'd like to deeply thank all of the speakers for the incredibly inspiring and powerful remarks. And I look forward to our next conversations, our next discussions. Thank you all.
Thank you.